Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the center of the stellar engineering bay aboard the research vessel Meridian, the warm amber glow of the holographic diagnostics panel casting long shadows across her exhausted face as she reached down to unzip her worn canvas backpack, the same one she'd carried through 3 continents and now 2 star systems, when suddenly out tumbled a small golden lion cub with a mane like spun honey, stretching its massive paws with a satisfied yawn before it locked eyes with her and let out the most apologetic chirp she had ever heard from an apex predator, immediately followed by a second cub, slightly smaller with darker markings, who pounced on the first one with pure chaotic joy before either of them seemed to understand where they were, or who the bewildered human woman standing before them might be. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, caught between laughter and genuine panic, as the bay's cool, recycled air mingled with the faint ozone smell of the active starship systems, the soft hum of the ship's massive engines thrumming beneath the metallic floor grating through her worn boots, and the 2 cubs, now fully alert and impossibly curious, began investigating everything within reach with the destructive enthusiasm only young predators possessed. The larger cub, whom she would later name Ember because of the russet tint to his mane, immediately began batting at the holographic display, his translucent paw passing right through the blue light with such confusion and betrayal on his fuzzy face that Sarah found herself kneeling down without thinking, her tired brown eyes softening as she whispered, "Oh, honey, no. That's real data from the stellar core analysis. You can't actually catch it." And when the cub turned to face her with what could only be described as profound embarrassment at having been caught committing this transgression, she reached out her weathered hand and let him sniff her palm, his warm breath like a small furnace against her skin, his wet nose pressing into her lifeline like he was reading her fortune. The second cub, smaller and more cautious, hung back near the backpack, her golden eyes, which reflected the ship's lights like 2 tiny moons, watching the interaction with careful intelligence before she took 3 deliberate steps forward and pressed her entire head into Sarah's chest, a purr rumbling through her small body so intensely that the human woman could feel it in her own ribs, could feel it pushing against the hollow space in her chest that had been empty since she left Earth 3 years ago. And Sarah, exhausted Sarah, lonely Sarah, broken-hearted Sarah, who had volunteered for this deep space research expedition specifically to get away from everything that hurt, wrapped both arms around the little creature and felt something crack open inside her like a door she'd welded shut finally giving way. It had been an impossible decision, finding these cubs. Sarah had discovered them 12 hours earlier during a routine survey expedition to Kepler 452b's Equatorial Research Station, abandoned but still functional, built decades ago by the first human expeditions to this strange golden world. She had been collecting atmospheric samples near the old biodome perimeter when she heard the crying, small, desperate mewing that cut through the alien landscape like a wound, and she'd found them huddled in a collapsed maintenance tunnel, their mother nowhere to be seen, their ribs visible through their fur, their paws bloody from trying to dig their way out. The decision to scoop them into her backpack, to make them her secret, had been immediate and instinctive, and absolutely against every protocol in the Meridian's crew manual, which explicitly prohibited bringing any extraterrestrial fauna aboard without full medical clearance and a minimum of 48 hours of quarantine analysis. But Sarah had looked at those faces, so young, so vulnerable, so utterly and completely dependent, and something in her refused to leave them behind. She'd been abandoned before, metaphorically speaking, and she recognized the shape of that abandonment, even in creatures that had never heard a human voice before, and so she'd made her choice. Consequences be damned, and slipped them into her pack during the return shuttle with only a water bottle and some emergency field rations to keep them calm. Now, kneeling in the engineering bay with one cub purring against her chest and another nosing at the various tools and cables with the focus of a surgeon and the impulse control of a toddler, she realized she'd made possibly the best or worst decision of her entire career, and she honestly couldn't tell which one it was, and also didn't particularly care because Ember, the larger cub, had just discovered the maintenance robot charging station and was currently having a complete existential crisis about the glowing red light, pouncing backward with his tail between his legs before pouncing forward again with the conviction of a warrior. And Sarah found herself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in what felt like years. The smaller cub, whom Sarah decided to call Comet because of the white streak that ran down her spine like she'd been brushed by a falling star, abandoned her hiding spot to investigate the source of Sarah's laughter, and when she realized it was directed at Ember, she immediately waddle-pounced on her larger brother with the clear intention of showing him up, knocking him sideways into a stack of power regulators that clanged with an awful metallic shriek that made all three of them freeze in mutual shock before Comet made the executive decision that this was actually a fantastic sound, and threw herself at the stack again, this time on purpose, producing a series of chaotic bell tones that echoed through the bay like some kind of avant-garde percussion concert. Sarah lunged forward, her tired muscles suddenly energized by panic, and managed to gently redirect both cubs away from the equipment, speaking in the soft voice she'd once used with her daughter, a memory so painful she usually kept it locked in a very deep place inside herself, saying things like, "Easy, easy, that's very expensive equipment, sweetheart. Yes, I know it makes a funny sound, but no, we can't keep making it make sounds." And somehow, impossibly, the cubs listened, because they looked at her like she was the center of their universe, like she had invented sunlight and water and the taste of prey, like being in her presence was itself a reward. And Ember leaned against her leg with a satisfied rumble while Comet curled up on her lap, and Sarah found herself stroking their fur in the darkness of the late-shift engineering bay. The only human aboard the Meridian who knew about them, the only person in this metal can hurtling through space who could even comprehend the risk she had taken. The real crisis came 4 hours later, when Sarah attempted to sneak them back to her quarters. She had rigged a makeshift enclosure from storage crates in her cabin, small and completely inadequate but the best she could manage on short notice, and was leading them through the narrow corridor when she heard footsteps echoing around the corner. Dr. Marcus Webb, the ship's security officer and also the man most likely to follow protocol with the enthusiasm of a zealot, appeared suddenly with a cup of coffee and a confused expression that slowly transformed into shock, then concern, then something that looked dangerously like he was about to activate his comm unit and report her to the captain. Sarah's hand immediately came up in a gesture of peace, and she spoke quickly, her voice low and urgent. "Marcus, I know how this looks, and I know what the regulations say, but I need you to understand something before you do what I know you're about to do. These cubs are intelligent. They are absolutely, demonstrably sentient. They have complex social structures. They show evidence of tool use observation. They respond to emotional cues, and they are currently looking at me like I am their entire world." As she spoke, Comet pressed forward between her legs, fixing Marcus with an unblinking stare of such pure innocence that he actually took a step backward, and Ember, never one to miss an opportunity, released a small chirp that somehow managed to sound simultaneously threatening and pitifully endearing. Marcus lowered his coffee cup slowly, his security-trained mind clearly warring with whatever part of his human brain was responding to the scene before him. A tired woman, two impossible creatures, a moment of connection so clear and undeniable that it transcended species and regulation. "Sarah," he said finally, and there was something like understanding in his voice. "The captain is going to have your head, but also, yes, they are absurdly cute, and I cannot believe I'm about to help you cover this up. But I have a storage pod in my quarters that's not on the official manifest, and if you happen to need somewhere to put," he gestured vaguely at the cubs, "these things, I would not see anything if I were not looking." Sarah spent the next week in a state of constant stress and constant, blazing joy that felt like it was going to burn right through her chest. During her shifts, She monitored stellar phenomena and ran system diagnostics like she always did. Her professional mask firmly in place. Professional mask cracking at the seams every second she wasn't actively working because all she could think about was getting back to the Cubs, getting back to Ember's ridiculous fear of his own reflection in the cabin's small mirror. Something that reset with brand new terror every single day, as if he'd never seen another lion before in his life. And Comet's growing obsession with the small rubber cable on one of her portable computers, which she had decided was not a cable, but rather a living thing requiring stalking, patient hunting, and occasional conversations in a language consisting entirely of chirps and growls, and what could only be described as increasingly aggressive negotiating. They grew visibly every day, putting on muscle and weight and confidence at a rate that seemed medically impossible, but which Sarah rationalized as a side effect of whatever unique metabolism their species possessed. And they became less clumsy and more purposeful, and their games became less accidental destruction and more deliberate testing of boundaries, to the point where Sarah found herself establishing genuine rules, which the Cubs generally ignored with the enthusiasm of philosophers debating the laws of physics. And through it all, through the stress and the fear and the constant anxiety about being discovered, there was also this deep, bone-deep contentment, because after years of loneliness, after the hollow years of running from her own life, Sarah had accidentally found a reason to stop running, and that reason had 4 paws and permanent expressions of confusion and absolute faith in her judgment. On the 8th night, Sarah was woken in the darkness of her cabin by Comet pressing her small head against Sarah's face, a distinctive worry in her body language, a tension that the normally playful cub only showed when she sensed something was wrong. Sarah's eyes snapped open, a skill she'd maintained from her pre-space years, that ability to go from deep sleep to full alert in seconds. And she realized that the soft hum of the ship's systems had taken on a quality she recognized from her training, a particular vibration that meant something in the lower deck's reactor cooling system had registered an anomaly. She dressed quickly, leaving the Cubs in her cabin with whispered reassurances that she would return. But Ember refused to settle, pacing at the door with such obvious distress that Sarah's heart cracked a little and she let him out into the corridor, an impulse she immediately regretted when he bounded directly toward the emergency lift with the determination of a creature on a mission, and Comet, unwilling to be separated from her brother, shot after him, leaving Sarah no choice but to follow, moving quickly through the ship's interior at a pace just shy of panic, but not quite, because she trusted them, somehow, trusted that they knew something she didn't. The Cubs led her directly to the reactor chamber, a place she had been trained on but had never actually visited because she was a research scientist and reactor maintenance was the domain of the engineering crew. But here they were, the 2 Cubs pawing at the emergency bulkhead with a synchronization that spoke to some kind of instinct or shared awareness. And when Sarah opened the manual override and stepped inside, she saw it immediately. And the problem was immediately obvious to her scientific mind. A coolant leak in the secondary system, small but persistent, the kind of thing that would get exponentially worse over the next 6 to 8 hours, and could result in a catastrophic failure that would vent an entire section of the ship and kill everyone aboard, including her. Including Ember and Comet, who still had so much of their lives ahead of them, so much growing to do, so much chaos left to cause. Sarah acted on pure instinct and training, activating the emergency override and manually redirecting the coolant flow to the backup reservoir while simultaneously triggering the automated repair sequence that should have been handled by the engineering team during the day shift but somehow hadn't been. And as the system came back into balance and the emergency indicators shifted from red to yellow to finally, mercifully, green, she felt the Cubs press against her legs, their small bodies shaking with either fear or adrenaline or some combination of both, and she sank to the floor and gathered them both into her arms, because they had known, had somehow known that something was wrong, had guided her here through sheer instinct and the kind of connection that defied species and language and every rational explanation she could attempt to construct. "Thank you," she whispered into their fur. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." and Ember rumbled against her chest, and Comet licked her chin repeatedly in a series of gestures that Sarah chose to interpret as love, as loyalty, as the kind of connection that meant something beyond companionship. It meant survival. It meant family. It meant that these creatures had chosen her as much as she had chosen them. The next morning, alarms rang throughout the ship as the engineering team discovered the reactor leak and simultaneously discovered that someone had already addressed it, had manually corrected a problem that would have killed them all. There was an investigation, questions asked, and Sarah's heart had been in her throat for about 30 seconds before Marcus, wonderful, helpful Marcus, had produced a report showing that the automated systems had flagged the issue, and he himself had authorized the override remotely, which was technically plausible enough that the captain accepted it without further question. And Sarah had given Marcus a look of such profound gratitude that he'd actually blushed and mumbled something about owing her a drink at port, which wasn't the point, but was also kind of the point because they were human, and humans looked out for each other, especially when there were impossible cubs involved. The captain called an all-hands briefing late that afternoon, gathering the crew in the central hub of the Meridian to discuss the near-catastrophic failure and to praise the quick thinking of whoever had caught it before it could cascade into disaster. And Sarah stood in the back of the assembled crew members, her hand resting on a backup compartment where Ember and Comet were hiding. She'd sedated them mildly with a veterinary sedative she'd synthesized herself, just enough to keep them calm and quiet for an hour, and she felt them breathing against her leg, felt the weight of them like an anchor, like a reason to keep breathing. And when the captain called for whoever had done this to step forward, Sarah remained in the shadows. But Ember stirred slightly, and his paw brushed against her knee, and in that moment she realized something that settled into her bones like truth. These cubs weren't her secret anymore. They were her responsibility, her charge, and the entire ship was alive because of them, was floating safely through space, because they had cared enough about her to warn her, to guide her, to make sure she understood that danger was coming. When the briefing ended and the crew dispersed, Sarah carried the cubs back to her cabin and held them as they woke from their mild sedation, watching Comet's eyes flutter open first, then Ember's, and she looked at their young faces, the innocence there mixing with an intelligence that was growing more visible every day. And she made a decision that was probably against regulations, probably against protocol, probably against 1,000 rules that existed for very good reasons, but which felt right in her heart, in a way that nothing had felt right in a very long time. She accessed her personal logs and recorded a message to the captain, explaining everything. The discovery of the cubs on Kepler 452b, her decision to bring them aboard, the clear evidence of their sentience and their connection to her, and most importantly, the way that connection had saved every person on this ship. She encrypted the message with her personal security code and set it to auto-transmit in 48 hours unless she chose to delete it, which meant she had 2 days to prepare for whatever consequences were coming. And she spent those 2 days loving these cubs as fiercely as she possibly could, because she didn't know how much time they had together, and she was determined to make sure they knew that they had been chosen, that they were wanted, that they were loved by at least one human who understood the gift they represented to a universe that was so often cold and empty and utterly devoid of connection. When the captain called her into his office the morning after the message transmitted, Sarah's hands were steady even though her heart was doing impossible acrobatics inside her chest. She brought Ember and Comet with her, because hiding them felt like a betrayal of the entire point of what she was about to attempt to argue for. And when the captain saw them, really saw them, in his office, not filtered through crisis or emergency, but simply present, existing in his space with such obvious affection for the woman at the center of their small constellation, something in his expression shifted. Captain James Rodriguez was a man known for his adherence to protocol, his military bearing, his laser-focused commitment to the safety and operation of the Meridian. But he was also a grandfather, a man who had left 3 grandchildren back on Earth, and when Comet walked forward and placed her head against his leg with what could only be described as sympathy, He actually closed his eyes for a moment before speaking. "Dr. Chen," he said, and his voice was steady, but something underneath it was trembling. "You've put me in an incredibly difficult position. These creatures are not registered with scientific command. They were brought aboard without clearance. They represent an unknown biological risk to the crew, and by every measure of my job, I should be arranging to have them placed in stasis and detained at the nearest station pending a full review by the Science Council." He paused, and Ember took the opportunity to climb into Sarah's lap, which she was sitting in right in the captain's office, a small act of comfort that somehow encompassed everything. Everything about love and loyalty, and the kind of connection that mattered more than protocol. "However," the captain continued, "I have also reviewed the asteroid strike records from our approach vector this morning. Had it not been for whatever prompted you to discover and address that coolant leak 12 hours before automated systems would have detected it, we would currently be dealing with a catastrophic structural failure. And, based on the behavioral logs you provided, it appears that these creatures somehow alerted you to danger through means I do not fully understand, but which clearly exist outside of normal communication channels. Therefore, what I am going to do is this. You will have 90 days to compile complete biological and neurological data on these specimens. You will work with Dr. Webb to ensure they are fully integrated with ship medical and safety protocols. And at the end of that 90 days, we will submit a report to the Science Council recommending a complete reevaluation of the legal status of these creatures and their potential designation as sentient species, with all the protections that designation implies. But Dr. Chen, if anything goes wrong, if there is even one incident that threatens the safety of my crew, they will be locked down, and that is non-negotiable." Sarah had felt tears spilling down her face, even as she was nodding, even as she was thanking him, even as Ember was looking between the captain and Sarah with the profound confusion of someone trying to understand why humans made these strange leaking sounds when they were happy. The next 3 months passed in a blur of late-night data collection, endless medical scans, behavioral analysis, and the slow, steady process of falling completely and utterly in love with two small creatures who had somehow managed to save not just their own lives, but the lives of an entire human crew in the middle of the vast, indifferent cosmos. Sarah documented everything. The way Comet's hunting instincts had evolved from chaotic and destructive to focused and precise. The way Ember had learned to understand the difference between the various alert tones of the ship's communication system and could now recognize emergency alarms with better accuracy than some of the human crew. The way they both seemed to understand human emotional states with eerie accuracy, offering comfort when Sarah was sad or stressed, celebrating when she had successful experiments, even seeming to comprehend the concept of being proud of oneself when they successfully completed the obstacle course Marcus had helped her design as part of their neurological development assessment. On the 91st day, Sarah submitted her report to the Science Council with hands that were only slightly shaking. It was 200 pages of pure scientific documentation, backed by video evidence, physiological data, and behavioral analysis that demonstrated conclusively that the creatures, officially designated as Panthera sapiens cognita based on their biological classification and their clear evidence of sapient thought, represented not just a new species, but a completely new classification of Earth origin evolution. The Science Council took 3 weeks to respond, and during those 3 weeks, Sarah moved through the days in a state of anxious, suspended animation, because she had begun to allow herself to hope that Ember and Comet could stay, could remain aboard the Meridian not as specimens or experimental subjects, but as crew members, as family, as part of the community she had somehow found among the stars. When the message finally came through, when the official designation was granted, when the Cubs were awarded legal sentient status and all the protections and rights that came with it, Sarah sat down in the corridor of the ship and wept, and Ember and Comet crowded around her, their small bodies a warm fortress against her shaking shoulders, and she realized that she had found something she'd been running from her entire life, something she'd tried to bury with exhaustion and distance and the cold vastness of space. She had found home, not in a place, but in connection, not in safety, but in being needed and loved by creatures who asked nothing of her except her presence and her willingness to keep caring. Years later, long after they had returned to Earth and Sarah had spent millions of words and hours explaining to the scientific establishment what they had discovered, long after Ember and Comet had become media sensations and the first recognized example of non-human sapience in the documented galaxy, long after the laws had changed and the expectations of humanity's place in the universe had been fundamentally altered, Sarah would sometimes find herself back in a quiet moment with the two adults she had once held in her arms when they were small enough to fit in her lap. And she would remember the moment she opened that backpack and found her entire life changing in the space of a heartbeat. And she would understand with absolute clarity that it had never been about discovery or science, or even saving the ship, though those things had all mattered in their own ways. It had been about the oldest form of HFY, about the most fundamental human strength, the choice to recognize consciousness wherever we find it, the courage to love what we don't understand, and the willingness to change everything, our rules, our protocols, our understanding of our place in the cosmos, for the simple, profound belief that connection matters, that family transcends species, and that a woman's hand on a small golden creature's mane is the truest language the universe has ever known.